Hello, my name is Nicole Minder. This is for EDL 851, Supervision and Evaluation of School Personnel, Module 13, Case Study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. So just a summary of the case study. Principal Jean Wilson is in her fourth year at Crestview Elementary School. Mrs. Horton is a first grade teacher there, and she has been very successful there. She is well liked by the community. She's gotten several awards from being there. She's been there a long time. Unfortunately, after spring break in her third year as being principal there, Mrs. Horton's behavior starts to change, and she learns that her husband has moved out. She was hoping that over the course of the summer things would get better and that her behavior would return to what it was before, but a few weeks into her fourth year as principal there, she starts to receive complaints from parents about Mrs. Horton's behavior. And through all that, one parent in particular, Mr. Stopford, chooses to have a meeting with Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton to discuss his child's treatment, Julie, in Mrs. Horton's classroom, and really wants to resolve the problem. But Mrs. Wilson gets very argumentative and has a big outburst, and they aren't able to conduct the meeting. So problem identification and analysis. The problem is Mrs. Horton's increasingly inappropriate classroom behavior, which is leading to more parent complaints. Previously in the case study, it said that the Crestview Elementary parents were very pleased with the outcome of their students' education. Test scores were above average, and attendance for the students was really good. So getting parent complaints was very, it didn't happen a lot. So when it started to happen a lot, that raised some red flags. So how can Mrs. Wilson help get Mrs. Horton back on track so her students can succeed? So what we know, Mrs. Wilson is the principal. This is her fourth year being at Crestview Elementary School. It is one of 3 elementary schools in that district. And like I said, attendance had been good and test scores were above average, and parents seemed to be pleased with their students' education. Mrs. Horton is a first grade teacher there. She has previously been very successful there, has won very many prestigious awards, has been there for a really long time. But her husband recently moved out, and parents began to complain. Specifically, Mr. Stopford has his meeting with Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton regarding Julie's education. So what we need to know, why is Mrs. Horton having such a tough time with this class? Is this class different than the other classes? Is there a lot more behavior issues that is triggering her outbursts? Has Mrs. Wilson met with Mrs. Horton prior to all this about her behavior? What is triggering Mrs. Horton's behavior? Are her and her husband seeking professional help, like counseling or anything of that nature with her 2 sons, because she is stuck with raising her 2 teenage sons, which can be very difficult. And I would like to know the student input. So do the students feel like their education is being neglected? Do they feel targeted by Mrs. Horton? They're first graders, so that's a very vital age. So are her actions really hurting their educational experience? So my proposed plan of action, my first strategy would be to meet with Mrs. Horton about her behavior. I would include what I see as Mrs. Wilson seeing in her observations. Does Mrs. Horton understand that her behavior has changed? Or does she think that the students are acting differently and she's just reacting to their behavior? And does she know why her behavior has changed? And the second step to that would be to set up a plan to help Mrs. Horton recognize when she is getting upset so she does not have outbursts around the students. So strategy 2 would be to set up a private meeting with Mr. Stafford to discuss Mrs. Horton's behavior in their prior meeting, since she did get very argumentative and they weren't able to conduct the meeting. And I would listen to his concerns about his daughter's experience. And step 2 would be to set up a meeting with Mrs. Horton and Mr. Stratford again. With some sort of mediator, I would suggest the school counselor, to discuss the present issues and develop ways to resolve them. So communicating and collaborating with each other to help resolve those issues. And then strategy 3, it said that there was a lot of other parent complaints that had even been brought up to the superintendent. So I think that I would need to meet with other parents, or at least open up the door to meeting with other parents to hear their concern about Mrs. Horton's behavior. And then strategy 4, I would continue to regularly observe Mrs. Horton's class and collect data to see if her behavior changes. If it does not, I would suggest counseling sessions for her separately, or maybe for her and her family, maybe just her and her husband, or maybe the whole family together. Resolving the issues based on promoting the success of all students. First, I would speak to the other students in the classroom. So how do they feel about Mrs. Horton's behavior? Have they noticed a change since the beginning of the school? It was only 6 weeks in when Mrs. Wilson started getting all these complaints. So did they notice a change in her behavior? How can we help the students feel safe in her classroom if they do feel like they have been targeted by her? 2, providing all teachers with professional development on how to effectively communicate with students and parents. That would help Mrs. Horton feel supported by me, but also that supports student success for all, and it doesn't target Mrs. Horton. It's open to all staff members, because in reality, all staff members can benefit from professional development, especially when communicating with students and parents. So she wouldn't feel like she was being targeted, and we would also be helping the rest of the students and parents of our school feel like they are able to communicate with their student teachers better. Number 3, I would potentially move Julie Stafford to a different class. It would be pretty difficult to mend the relationship between Mr. Stafford and Mrs. Horton. I think that Mr. Stafford, after his interaction with Mrs. Horton, it would be hard to get him to give her a second chance. So maybe he would just be, even if Mrs. Horton's behavior changed, he might still just always have an issue with her. So maybe that's something that we need to look into. And I would be wondering if Mrs. Horton could unintentionally target Julie just because of what did happen with her dad. And then 4, I would conduct walkthroughs several times a week at various times into Mrs. Horton's classroom, just as an administration presence in the room. That would help the students feel safer. Maybe Mrs. Horton would feel more supported, and then I could see what is actually happening in the classroom. So debriefing the problem, throughout this, I was thinking I need to resolve this issue quickly due to the number of complaints. Do we as a school have to have a parent meeting for all the students in Mrs. Horton's class? Maybe involve people who are higher up in the district if needed. I was feeling concerned for Mrs. Horton's home life. It sounds like she's been going through a lot. So I don't want what I do to be even more of an issue and a problem, adding to all the struggles that she's had. But at the same time, she needs to know that her behavior is inappropriate and that it needs to change. But in that, I would want to support her in any way that I can. I was also feeling the need to help all students succeed in Mrs. Horton's class, and the need to resolve Mr. Stafford's concerns about his daughter's education, because if it was my student in her classroom, I would want my voice to be heard. And especially if he doesn't feel like the problem is resolved for Julie, he can definitely continue to make waves. So resolving all of his concerns and then addressing the other parents' concerns, I think, is really important. And then I was really valuing the success of all students, Mrs. Horton's success as a teacher in my school, because if she's not feeling successful, then I'm not successful. And also, I want the parents of all my students to feel safe with Mrs. Horton educating their children. So some of the unresolved issues that I saw, what will potential counseling sessions bring up for Mrs. Horton or her family? Will Mrs. Horton's behavior change in a positive way? Can we repair the damaged relationship between Mrs. Horton and Julie and her dad? And how do the students feel about Mrs. Horton's behavior? So reflect on Standard 2 by providing evidence that you as an educational leader promotes the academic success and personal well-being of every student by enhancing instructional capacity. So promoting the academic success of every student by enhancing instructional capacity, I would provide training for all staff that enhances their knowledge in how to communicate with students and parents. I would analyze the data from the weekly walkthroughs and discuss that with Mrs. Horton and maybe talk to the school counselor if that's who Mrs. Horton is talking to. And then if I was a superintendent, I would want to know some of the updates in this case. So maybe involving the superintendent. And then, like I said, bi-weekly one-on-ones with Mrs. Horton, maybe talking about what improvements she has seen in herself and for her students. And then how are the other students reacting or being affected by either her change in behavior or in the lack of change in her behavior, so that she is able to reflect on how she is acting in class. Promoting the personal well-being of every student. Walkthroughs in Mrs. Horton's class. Is she following up on parent communication? Is she using the skills given to her in professional development? Promoting positive relationships with every student. So I would have little check-ins with her students to see how they feel everything is going. Is the current plan of action working? Are students being more successful in her class? Is her behavior changing? And are we still getting parent complaints? And if the answers to those questions are no, then maybe we need to revisit the plan and revise it. And enhancing instructional capacity, increase collaboration and communication between all stakeholders, and that was talked about a little bit in Strategy 2 and in Strategy 3 of my action plan. Providing professional development for all teachers, discussing improvements of parent-student communication and effective teaching strategies, and provide administrative support for all teachers going through rough times at home. That can be really hard when it feels like their home life is kind of falling apart, to then come to school and act like you have it all together. So I would talk to all my staff members and just let them know that I am there for them and there are resources for them. And then applaud strengths of all teachers and develop their weaknesses. Specifically with Mrs. Horton, I know that there was a lot of parent complaints, but I'm sure that there were students that she was reaching out to and really getting their attention and allowing their success too. So I'm sure that there were success stories in that classroom. It can't all be bad. So I would applaud her strengths, but develop the parent communication, because it seems to be one of her weaknesses. And then student communication also. I think that she needs to improve the way that she talks to students. Maybe it's more of a negative tone when she does talk to them. And maybe we can change that to be in a more positive tone. So thank you for watching this, and thank you for this course.